Montana Territory, August 1878. The sun was setting blood orange behind the jagged peaks of the Bitterroot Range when Zadie Fairchild stumbled onto the dusty trail, her wedding dress torn at the hem and streaked with ash and blood. Her veil had long since blown away. The satin buttons down her back were ripped loose. Her boots were gone. She had run until her legs gave out, then crawled until she saw the outline of a man on horseback against the fading light, his silhouette framed by the glow like some kind of answer to a prayer whispered too late. The cowboy reined in his horse, boots hitting the dirt as he swung down, and approached her slow, one hand near his holster, the other raised in caution. "Madam?" His voice was low, rough-edged but not unkind. He crouched a few feet away, his dark eyes scanning her face, then the rest of her. "Are you hurt?" Zadie pressed a hand to her ribs. Her fingers came away sticky. "I do not know," she answered, voice shaking. "I think I might be." The man's jaw clenched. He stepped forward and eased off his coat, wrapping it around her shoulders before she could protest. "Name's Xalen Boone," he said as he helped her to her feet. "There's a doctor 2 miles back in White Hollow. Can you ride?" She nodded, though her body trembled under the weight of exhaustion. He helped her up onto his horse, then mounted behind her, steadying her with one arm. She did not ask if he was real or a vision. He was warm, solid, and he rode like the earth was on fire behind them. When they reached the town's edge, he shouted for help. The doctor, a wiry man with tobacco-stained fingers, examined her quickly and quietly behind a curtain, stitched a gash at her side, and gave her something to help her sleep. That night, she lay in a borrowed cot in the back room of the doctor's cabin, the coat still wrapped around her. She stared at the ceiling beams, listening to crickets hum outside and the occasional creak of boots on the porch. The cowboy had not left. She could feel it. In the morning, Zadie found him sitting outside with a tin cup of coffee, elbows on his knees, hat tipped back. His shirt was dusted with trail dirt, his eyes rimmed with tiredness, but he looked up when she stepped out barefoot. "You look better," he said. "I feel worse," she admitted, voice quiet. Xalen stood and nodded toward a bench. She sat. He sat beside her, not too close. "What happened?" he asked gently. Zadie stared down at her torn dress. "I was supposed to be married yesterday. In Helena. My father arranged it. He said it would fix things." Xalen waited. The man he was. Cruel. "I tried to run the night before, but he caught me. Then I waited until morning. When the preacher came, I ran again. He came after me. He would have." She swallowed hard. "I found a horse and rode south. They chased me. I fell. I do not remember after that. Just dust and pain." Xalen did not speak right away. He let the quiet sit between them. "You did the right thing," he said finally. "Getting out. You did what you had to." Zadie blinked against sudden tears. "I do not know what to do now." "Well," he said, standing and stretching, "you are wearing my coat, and I have coffee. That is a start." She laughed once, soft and surprised. Over the next few days, Zadie stayed at the doctor's cabin, helping where she could. She peeled potatoes, swept the porch, read to an elderly patient who had gone half-blind. Xalen came by every morning. He brought her boots that fit and a dress borrowed from the preacher's wife. He brought her bread and canned peaches and, once, a folded piece of paper with a pencil sketch of a horse and rider. "Thought you might want to draw," he said gruffly, not meeting her eyes. She smiled and took it from him, fingers lingering longer than they needed to. One afternoon, Zadie found him down by the river, repairing a fence that had collapsed in the spring floods. She climbed down the embankment carefully, her skirt gathered in her hands. "You do not have to keep looking after me," she said. He hammered in silence, then looked up. "I know. So why are you?" Xalen leaned against the post and wiped his brow. "Because you ran from something awful, and I know what that feels like. And because when you looked at me that first night, I saw something in your eyes I have not seen in a long time. Hope. Even if it was just a flicker. Zadie looked down at her hands. It was more than a flicker. He stepped close then, slow, like he was giving her time to move. She did not. His fingers brushed her cheek, then tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. You are strong, he said. Stronger than you think. But you do not have to do everything alone. She leaned into his touch, eyes closed. That evening, as the sun dipped low and the air turned cool, he rode back with her behind him on the saddle again, just like the first night. She rested her cheek against his back, arms around his waist. They did not speak, but something settled between them unspoken and steady. Zadie stayed in White Hollow. She took work at the mercantile, helped teach letters to the younger children in the chapel hall. Her name was whispered in the town with curiosity and a little awe, the woman who arrived in a ruined wedding dress, bloodied and alone, and who now walked with her chin high. And Xalen Boone, he was never far. When she needed a shelf built, he came. When the wind tore the roof shingles, he was up there before she could ask. When she sat by the river to sketch, he brought her apples and sat nearby, carving wood with his knife. One night, about a month after she had arrived, she stood outside the mercantile, watching the stars. Xalen approached, his boots soft on the packed dirt. I was thinking, he said. She turned. About what? He held out something wrapped in cloth. She opened it. Inside was the same wedding dress, cleaned and mended. The tiers were stitched with care, the buttons replaced, the lace repaired by hand. Her breath caught. I figured, he said, voice rough, you might want to keep it. Not because of what it was, but because of who you became in it. Zadie stared at him, tears rising. You did this? He shrugged. Seemed right. She stepped close and took his face in her hands. You are the first man who has ever seen me as more than what I could do for him. Xalen's hands closed around her waist, eyes dark and steady. You are not a burden, Zadie. You are a partner. If you will have me. She kissed him, there under the stars, and he kissed her back like she was the only reason the world kept turning. And in that moment she knew no matter how battered her past had been, her future had just begun. The wind carried the scent of pine and warm dirt as autumn crept into the valley. In the higher hills, the larches had begun to turn, gold-tipped and trembling in the morning chill. Zadie walked the path behind the chapel one afternoon with a basket on her arm and a scarf pulled tight around her shoulders. She had started bringing food to the widower Lars Gunderson and his 2 sons every third day, ever since the younger boy had broken his leg and couldn't help with the livestock. She didn't mind the walking. The quiet between her steps and the birdsong overhead settled something inside her, something that had been loud and scraping for too long. She came down the hill and found Xalen near the edge of the Gunderson property, tugging heavy stones from a shallow trench. His sleeves were rolled to the elbows, and his hat had been tossed aside in the grass. Sweat clung to the back of his neck, and a streak of dirt ran from his jaw to the collar of his shirt. He didn't notice her at first, and she took a moment to watch the way he moved, deliberate, sure, like each motion came from knowing the land wouldn't give more than it took. You keep showing up in the places I least expect, she said. He didn't startle, just straightened and turned, squinting against the sun. You're early. They finished the sorting at the mercantile faster than I thought. He wiped his hands on his trousers. Lars's fencing's half rotted through down here. Figure it won't hold through first snow. She set the basket down near the stones. You helping every family in the valley now, or just the ones with bad luck? Just the ones with a reason to keep going, he said plainly. She didn't answer. Instead, she crouched beside the trench and picked up a splintered post. You always this helpful? He rubbed the back of his neck. No. They worked in companionable silence for a while. She passed him nails, kept the tools in reach. He fit the posts deep into the packed soil, his shoulders flexing with the effort. When she stood to stretch her legs, he caught her eye and jerked his chin toward the woods. There's a ridge up yonder, he said. Good view west if you want to see the sun drop behind the trees. She hesitated, then nodded. Only if you come too? They left the tools stacked under a tarp and followed the deer path up the slope, where the pines thinned and the sky widened. At the top, the grass grew long and rust-colored, and the air smelled faintly of wild mint. They sat side by side on a flat rock, the warmth of the day still clinging to it. "Did you grow up near here?" she asked after a time. "No. Grew up east of here. Nebraska plains." "Nothing but wind and sky. What brought you west?" He dug his boots into the dirt. "The army came through. I signed on. Thought it'd give me something solid." She waited. "Did 4 years riding under men who didn't give a damn about the places they'd burned. Got out after Wounded Knee. Couldn't look at a fire without remembering the screaming." Zadie didn't speak. She reached out and let her hand rest on his, not squeezing, just there. "I don't talk about that much," he said. "I won't ask you to again," she answered. He turned his hand, laced their fingers together. "You're not what I expected when you came stumbling out of the trees. I wasn't expecting to find someone like you either," she said. "But I think I'm glad I did." They sat until the sky bled lavender and orange, until the shadows stretched long and the first stars blinked out above them. Later, as they walked back down toward town, he touched her wrist gently. "I know you're building something here. A life. You don't owe me part of it. I want to offer it," she said. "If you'll take it." His answer was simple. "I already have." And though no promises were spoken under the open sky, something firm and quiet passed between them, something that wouldn't break with winter or time. The morning after the first frost, Zadie stepped into the small cabin Xalen had built with his own hands, just 2 rooms, a stone hearth, and a lean-to for wood, but it was solid, warm, and smelled faintly of cut pine. He stood near the back wall, shoulders dusted with sawdust, fitting a shelf between 2 beams. "You never sit still," she said, setting a tin of jam on the table. He looked over his shoulder. "Stillness gets me thinking too much." She ran her palm across the rough sanded table he'd made from a wind-felled birch. "And what do you think about when you let yourself?" He set the shelf into place and tested its strength with one hand. "Lately? Whether this place can carry 2 people. Are you asking if there's room for me, or if you're ready for it?" Xalen turned, wiping his hands on a cloth. "I've been alone a long time, Zadie. I know how to keep things quiet and running, but I don't know how to make someone feel at home." She pulled her shawl tighter around her arms. "You already have. You just haven't noticed." He crossed the room and leaned his hand against the doorframe beside her. "You never ask for anything." "I've learned not to," she said. "But that doesn't mean I don't want things." "What do you want?" "I want to plant something and watch it grow. I want a roof that doesn't belong to another man's name. I want to wake up and know the person beside me chose to stay. You think I'd leave? I don't think you would. But I've been wrong before." He studied her face, as if weighing what he could promise. Then he reached behind her and pulled out a small tin box from the mantel. Inside were seeds, heirloom beans, squash, and something labeled sweet corn in faded pencil. "I got these off a trader last week," he said. "Wasn't sure why. Guess I do now." Her eyes caught on the date scrawled inside the lid, spring 1875. "When the ground thaws, we'll plant them," he continued. "You can show me how to keep them alive." She blinked, then smiled slowly. "We'll need fencing. And something to chase off the crows. I'll build the fence." "You teach me about crows." They spent the afternoon marking out the garden, her with a stick, him with a spade, and by late day they were both covered in dry soil and laughing when the corner string snapped and smacked him in the chin. She leaned against his shoulder, catching her breath. "We're going to make something here," she said. He rested his chin on her head. "We already have." That night she cooked with what little they had: salt pork, beans, and a bit of cornmeal she traded for. They ate at the table he'd built, knees bumping beneath it, the lamplight catching the curve of her cheek and the edge of his jaw. After the dishes were washed and put away, he stepped outside to split firewood. She followed, arms crossed against the cold. "Do you think people like us ever get to stop looking over our shoulders?" she asked. He steadied the log with one hand, axe balanced in the other. "I think we keep looking forward until what's behind us fades. Do you believe that's possible? I didn't used to. But I do now." She didn't speak, just walked over and took the log from him, set another in its place. He didn't stop her. When the firewood was stacked, they stood on the porch, watching the stars blink into place. A coyote called somewhere beyond the ridge, and she leaned into him. "I never thought I'd trust a man again," she said. "And I never thought I'd care what someone thought of me," he replied. She reached for his hand, fingers threading through his. "But we were both wrong." He looked down at her, eyes steady. "I'm glad we were." Inside, they undressed in silence, the air filled only with the sounds of wool sliding over skin and the pop of logs in the hearth. When they lay down, he curled his hand over her hip, and she pressed her forehead to his chest. They did not speak again that night, but the quiet between them was full of promise, and when morning came, either had moved. By mid-October, the wind sharpened and carried the tang of snow from the high passes. Zadie pulled her shawl tighter as she walked the ditch trail east of town, where the cottonwoods dropped yellow leaves in slow spirals to the ground. She carried a small ledger in her basket, one the schoolteacher had given her to record deliveries and store tallies. The preacher had asked her to help keep order to the winter ration lists: beans, flour, candles, salt, and she had taken to it with the same quiet steadiness she gave to everything now. Xalen met her at the fork in the trail, reins in hand, his horse loaded with feed sacks from the trading post. He wore a brown wool coat she hadn't seen before, threadbare at the collar but neatly patched, and his hat was pulled low over his brow. "Thought you'd still be at the chapel," he said as she approached. "They ran out of ink before I ran out of numbers," she said. "So I figured I'd walk home the long way." He reached for her basket without asking and slung it over his saddle horn. "You've got a half-mile of slope left." "Right." She hesitated, then mounted, settling sideways on the saddle. He led the horse at a slow walk, the creak of leather and distant call of a hawk the only sounds between them. She watched him from the corner of her eye. "You ever think about what comes after the ground freezes?" "I think about the barn roof leaking," he said. "And whether the chickens'll stop laying by December. Anything past that?" He looked up at her, then forward again. "I got offered work. Springtime. A fella north of Flathead Lake wants help clearing timber for a mill road. Good pay. A cabin on the edge of the job site." She sat straighter. "You thinking of going? Only if you come too?" Her breath caught. "That'd be a long way from White Hollow." "I know." She let the silence stretch. A squirrel darted from one tree to another, scattering leaves in its wake. "What makes you think I'd want to leave?" "I don't," he said. "But I also don't want to keep you somewhere small if you're meant to grow bigger." She hooked her hands over the saddle horn. "I never had the chance to decide where to be." "Not really." "Then maybe it's time," he said. They reached the clearing behind the cabin just as the sun dipped low and golden across the grass. He helped her down from the horse and handed her the basket. She didn't let go of his hand right away. "I want to stay," she said finally. "Not because I'm afraid to go, but because this place has started to feel like mine. Like ours." He nodded once. "Then I'll stay." She stepped closer. "You sure? I didn't build that roof to keep the snow off just me." Later, she lit the lamps while he chopped the last of the kindling. She set the ledger aside and stirred the stew pot, adding a pinch of the dried sage they'd traded for last week. It filled the cabin with a smell that reminded her of late summer and clean wine through open windows. When he came in, dusted with wood chips, she handed him a bowl and sat beside him on the bench. "I've been thinking," she said between bites. "We could build a small shed behind the garden. For tools. Maybe a smokehouse too." He chewed thoughtfully. "We've got the space. And come spring, I'd like to keep hens. Maybe a goat." He smiled, a slow curve that reached his eyes. You're planning years ahead now. She rested her elbow on the table, chin in her hand. That doesn't scare me anymore. He reached across the table and brushed his thumb across her knuckles. It doesn't scare me either. The wind howled once past the chimney, then died down. Inside, the warmth from the fire and the closeness between them held steady. When the dishes were set aside, she stood and crossed the room to the shelf he'd hung last week. She placed the ledger beside the seed tin and turned to him with her brow furrowed. I've never asked you what made you stop writing? Before all this. He leaned against the wall, arms crossed. There was a boy. About 10. He ran out of a dugout during a raid. Someone thought he was a threat. He wasn't. Zadie blinked once, then reached for his hand. You carry that? Every day. She stepped closer, resting her forehead against his chest. Then let me carry some of it too. He wrapped his arms around her, firm and sure. You already do. That night, as they lay in bed, her hand rested over his heart. The fire flickered low, casting long shadows on the walls. Outside, frost crept across the fields, claiming the last of the autumn grass. But inside, the warmth held. And in the quiet, Zadie whispered, I never knew a man could look at me and see something worth staying for. He didn't answer with words. He pulled her closer, the rhythm of his breathing steady against her ear, and stayed that way until sleep took them both. By late November, the sun barely cleared the ridge before slipping behind it again, casting long shadows across the valley by afternoon. Zadie sat at the cabin table, needle in hand, piecing together a lining for the winter coat she'd found in the chapel's donation chest. The wool was still strong, though stiff with age, and she'd stitched a bit of her old dress into the inner hem not from sentiment, but thrift. She'd learned to make do without ceremony. Xalen came in with snow along his shoulders, a bundle of kindling under one arm and a wide-eyed hen tucked against his chest. She wandered off again, he said, setting both down. Found her huddled under the root cellar eaves. Zadie laid the coat aside and knelt to check the bird's feet. She's cold, but not frostbit. You've got a soft spot for her. She lays brown eggs. Far as I'm concerned, she's family. Zadie glanced up. You say that like you've had a family before. He sat on the bench and pulled off his gloves. Not one that stayed. My older brother left for Kansas when I was small. Never wrote. My mother died the year I turned 15. My father drank himself through the next 3. And after that? I took the horse and left. Worked for whoever had a bed and didn't ask too many questions. Zadie placed the hen in a basket near the hearth and covered it with a burlap sack. That's not a life. That's surviving. I didn't know there was a difference until I met you. She stood, rubbing her arms. You ever wonder what your mother would think of this place? He looked around the room, the low shelves lined with jars, the patchwork curtains she'd sewn from old flour sacks, the fire holding steady in the stone hearth. She'd say I stayed too long in the wind before finding a place to land. Zadie stepped close. And do you think you've landed now? He reached for her hand, callous thumb brushing across her knuckles. I know I have. That night, they boiled the last of the dried apples with honey and shared it with flatbread by the fire. Afterward, Zadie laid the finished coat across the bed and turned toward him with something new in her eyes, unspoken, but certain. I've been thinking, she said, folding her hands in front of her, about what it means to stand beside someone when the world turns hard. He waited. I want this forever, she said. Not just the safety, not just the quiet. I want the mornings where we're both too tired to speak, and the nights when the snow piles up against the door, and we still feel warm. He crossed the room and took her face in his hands, rough palms cradling her like something sacred. Zadie Fairchild, he said low, will you be my wife? She nodded once, her eyes full. Yes. Without hesitation. They married a week later, in the preacher's parlor, with the doctor and his wife standing witness. Zadie wore the mended dress again, hem let down and sleeves altered, and Xalen wore a clean shirt with a collar she'd stitched herself. There were no flowers, no music, but when he took her hand and said the words, it felt like the earth had stilled around them, holding its breath. Afterward they walked back to the cabin under a sky full of pearl-gray clouds, her fingers tucked beneath his coat. Inside, they lit the fire and warmed cider with cloves. She braided her hair down her back while he rolled out the mattress with fresh quilts. They didn't speak much that evening, but their movements were full of quiet assurance, like two people who'd already begun the rest of their lives. The first snow came heavy, blanketing the valley in silence. Zadie set out feed each morning before the sun crested the ridge, and Xalen kept the firewood stocked and the roof clear. At night, they read aloud from an almanac, laughed over the misprinted maps, and made plans for the spring rose beans, squash, and the sweet corn still waiting in its tin. In late March, they built the garden fence together, post by post, her measuring, him digging. The ground was still stubborn with frost, but they worked slow and steady, their sleeves rolled and hair damp beneath their hats. By May, the rows were planted, the coop finished, and the smokehouse nearly framed. Zadie's hands had grown rough with work, her shoulders stronger, her smile easier. Xalen carved her a small wooden box, plain but smooth, with a tiny Z etched into the lid. She kept it on the shelf beside the seeds. The two of them grew together like the things they planted, rooted, reaching, always toward the same light. Years passed, marked by harvests and thaw, by the steady rhythm of work and rest. They never left White Hollow. They didn't need to. The land gave, and they gave back. Children came first, one, then a second, both born in the same small room where they had once measured out flour and stitched linings into coats. They taught the children to mend fences, to read the weather, to speak plainly and mean it. In the evenings they sat on the porch with mugs of chicory brew, watching the wind move through the grass. Zadie kept drawing, sketching the ridge as it changed season to season, the curve of her children's cheeks, the way Xalen's eyes creased deeper with time. She never sold a piece. She didn't need to prove anything anymore. Xalen stopped dreaming of fire. He dreamed instead of planted rows and his daughter's laugh, of Zadie's hand warm in his as they walked back from town in the fading light. They grew old with the land. Not fast, not all at once. Just enough to know they'd lived every moment of it. And when the last frost came 1 year later than expected, Zadie stood beside the first bloom of sweet corn, her hand resting on Xalen's shoulder, and smiled. They had made something lasting. And they never stopped choosing each other. Not once. Not ever.